getting to know our local area pastors. It's time for The Pastor's Perspective on KCIS.
And in the studio once again, a good friend, my own pastor, Pastor Barry Crane of North Sound Church in Edmonds. Hello there, Barry.
Hi, Mark. Good to be with you again.
Good to have you in studio talking about something that we want to explore, and that is how to get along with each other, how to get along after these COVID times, coming out of a lot of this COVID lockdowns and a lot of the stress of the last year. You've been doing a series at church called The Art of Neighboring, looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan and that question that was asked, okay, well then, who's my neighbor? And Jesus told this wonderful story about the Good Samaritan. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
That's right. So, parable of the Good Samaritan is in Luke chapter 10, and it's in the context of a lawyer, the King James Version, I think, says a scribe, who asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was. Jesus responded, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so the scripture says that he wanted to justify himself. He wanted to make himself look good. And so he asks a further follow-up question saying, who's my neighbor? And so that's when Jesus goes into the story of the Good Samaritan. And I would imagine that perhaps most of our listeners are familiar with the story. I'm not going to read it, but essentially, as a pastor, it's a story that is difficult to read because the religious professionals are the bad guys in this story.
Yeah.
This guy gets beat up between Jerusalem and Jericho. Probably shouldn't have been on the road by himself because there was a history of bandits there. But nonetheless, he's beat up, laying on the side of the road. And a priest walks by and ignores him, crosses the other side. A Levite, which was sort of a genealogical priest associated with the temple. And so the Levite walks by, same thing, ignores the guy. Now, there may be some excuses for them around ritual unrighteousness and things like uncleanliness as a result of touching a body that might be dead. But really, from a perspective of care, they just didn't have it. So a Samaritan comes by, and the Samaritan, if you want to talk about racism, as we have been in the last year, Samaritans were half Jewish, half Gentile, were completely rejected by the Jews because of their race. And yet, he's the hero of Jesus' story. Quite honestly, although that's not the purpose of our talk here, I think it says something about our attitude as followers of Jesus towards racial issues when Jesus makes the hero of the story a guy that was the object of racist attention. So the story is narrated, and the hero of the story is the Good Samaritan. He binds up the wounds, puts the guy on his donkey, takes them to the hotel, tells the innkeeper, look after him, here's some money, and if you need more my next time through on my next sales trip, I'm going to, I'll pay you for it. And then Jesus says to the guy, so who was the neighbor? Now, this was really hard for a Jewish leader, Jewish religious leader. He doesn't say a Samaritan. He doesn't describe that racial entity. He just says the one that was kind to him, the one that looked after him. And when I looked at our community, so on Sunday morning before I come to church, Mark, you wouldn't know this, but I often read my Edmonds News, and I read the police blotter. For some reason, they bring it out on Sunday morning.
Oh, yeah.
So I read the police blotter, and I followed over the course of last fall a fight between neighbors. And so in September 25th on Talbot Road, 8200 block, there's a complaint of somebody throwing trash and dog poop in a victim's yard. And then September 30th, 8200 block, Talbot Road, a resident reports another incident, ongoing issue of subject placing trash on his property. And we don't have time for me to go through each one of these, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these incidents of this kind of an issue going on with neighbors. And this creates a challenge for us in neighboring. How do you actually come around and serve people in that kind of an environment? And yet the Good Samaritan tells us that we are all called to that kind of neighboring. And the thing I can't emphasize enough, Mark, is that this is the great commandment. And all of us who are followers of Jesus understand loving God, right? But do we really understand how critical it is, based upon what Jesus said, is the great commandment to actually love our neighbor when they're Democrats or when they're Republicans? How do we do that? Well, Jesus says we have to figure it out.
We have to figure it out, and it's kind of a cliffhanger for our next episode. We're going to try and figure this out. How do we love our neighbor? How do we be better neighbors? That's what this series is about with Pastor Barry Crane of North Sound Church in Edmonds. My pastor, can say that unashamedly. My pastor, my wife and I have gone to North Sound for a number of years now. He was preaching this sermon recently, and I thought it might be good to share with our listeners here on KCIS.
To get involved with the Pastor's Perspective feature on KCIS, you can call our front desk at 206-546-7350. You can also find out more information and listen to previous perspectives at kcisradio.com.